You grew up thinking myths were just stories, bedtime nonsense, ancient people trying to explain a world they didn't understand yet. But the real answer is far stranger. Some of the wildest, most impossible-sounding myths in human history weren't invented. They were remembered. Think about that for a second. Remembered. Somewhere out there, a flood really did drown the world your ancestors knew. A city really did burn the way the old poets said. And a bone really did look enough like a monster that an entire civilization built a legend around it. You just never learned which parts were real. Let's start with the flood. Almost every ancient culture on Earth has one. The Sumerians tell it. The Babylonians tell it. The Hebrews tell it in Genesis. Hindu texts describe it. Even cultures with no contact with each other, separated by oceans and mountains and thousands of years, somehow arrived at the same story. A flood so massive it erased the old world completely. For a long time, historians assumed this was coincidence. Every culture lives near water. Every culture has floods. Why wouldn't they all invent a flood myth independently? But then two geologists, William Ryan and Walter Pittman, looked at the floor of the Black Sea. And what they found changed everything. Around 5600 BCE, they argued, rising Mediterranean waters broke through a narrow ridge near what is now Istanbul. Salt water poured into a freshwater lake basin at a scale almost impossible to picture. 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls. Every single day. For months. Entire villages along the ancient shoreline would have had hours, maybe days, to run. Families who had lived by that lake for generations would have watched the water rise faster than they could outrun it. Some of them didn't outrun it. Do you see where this is going? The people who survived that event didn't write it down. They didn't have writing yet. So they did the only thing they could. They told their children. And their children told their grandchildren. Generation after generation, the story traveled outward from that one basin, changing shape, gaining gods, gaining arcs and animals two by two, until it turned into scripture in a dozen different languages. The myth wasn't a metaphor. It was a memory, worn smooth by 10,000 years of retelling. Now here's where it gets stranger. For centuries, historians treated the Trojan War the same way they treated the flood. A beautiful piece of fiction. Homer's imagination, nothing more. A city called Troy. A stolen queen named Helen. A wooden horse full of soldiers. Poetic, but surely invented. Then, in 1870, a wealthy amateur archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann did something historians thought was almost embarrassing. He took the Iliad literally. He read Homer's descriptions like a treasure map instead of a poem, and he went looking for the exact hill in northwestern Turkey that matched the geography Homer described. He found a city there. Then he found 8 more cities, stacked on top of each other like layers of a cake, each one built on the ruins of the last. Layer 7 showed clear signs of violent destruction, burned buildings, weapons, a siege. Was it the Troy? The actual war Homer sang about? Archaeologists still argue over the details today, but the core claim that a real city existed where the myth said it existed, and that it really did fall to fire and violence around the time the legend describes, is no longer in dispute. A story people had dismissed as pure fantasy for over 2,000 years turned out to have a real address. You have to wonder what else got dismissed too quickly. Which brings us to dragons. Nearly every ancient culture has some version of a dragon. Chinese dragons, European dragons, griffins guarding gold in Central Asia, enormous reptilian or half-bird, half-beast creatures, often described as having bones, teeth, or claws, far larger than anything alive. For centuries, scholars treated these as pure imagination, humanity's fear of predators given a monstrous shape. But a classicist named Adrian Mayer started asking a different question. What if people in the ancient world were actually finding something? She began tracing dragon and griffin legends back to the exact regions where they originated and cross-referencing them with the fossil record. And the overlap was hard to ignore. Ancient trade routes through Central Asia ran directly through territory rich with fossilized remains of Protoceratops, a beaked, four-legged dinosaur with a bony frill around its skull. Exposed by wind erosion, its skeleton would have looked, to someone with no concept of dinosaurs, exactly like a lion-sized beast with a beak and claws guarding a nest. In China, enormous fossilized bones were already being unearthed and sold as dragon bones for medicine as early as the 4th century. The people digging them up weren't guessing that something massive and unfamiliar once walked the earth. They were holding the evidence in their hands. Nobody in the ancient world had the concept of extinction. There was no framework for, this creature lived millions of years ago and no longer exists. So when people found bones too large for any known animal, they didn't conclude the past was different. They concluded the present was still hiding something enormous, somewhere just out of sight. The dragon wasn't a fear of the unknown. It was a reasonable explanation for physical evidence built by people using the only tools they had. Here's the pattern running underneath all three of these stories. Your ancestors weren't gullible. They weren't naive. They were doing exactly what you would do with the same information. They saw a bone too big to belong to anything alive, and they built a creature around it. They watched water swallow their home in a matter of days, and they built a flood around it. They found the burned remains of a city, and they built a war around it. Every myth is a translation. It takes a real, physical, terrifying event and runs it through generations of human memory, which is not a video camera. Human memory compresses. It exaggerates. It looks for meaning. A psychologist named Elizabeth Loftus spent much of her career proving exactly this about individual memory. It doesn't record events, it reconstructs them, and every retelling reshapes the story slightly. Now multiply that by 500 generations. That's what a myth is. Not a lie. A 500-generation game of telephone, starting with something that actually happened. So the next time you hear a story that sounds too strange to be real, a giant beast, a world-ending flood, a city swallowed by fire, don't assume it's fiction. Ask what it's a translation of. Ask what your ancestors were actually looking at when they decided this story was worth telling their children. Because somewhere back there, in the smoke of a real burning city, in the mud of a real drowned village, in the sand around a real fossilized skeleton, someone stood exactly where you're standing now. Confused, frightened, trying to make sense of something too big for the words they had. And they didn't call it a coincidence, they called it a myth. Maybe it's time you stopped thinking of myths as stories and started thinking of them as evidence.